Nobody spoke after the preacher said, "You may return to your seats." The wedding had lasted less than 4 minutes. Eliza Bennett stood alone beside the church altar, while whispers spread across the room faster than winter wind under a doorway. Caleb Turner had not touched her hand once during the ceremony. He had barely looked at her. Outside the church windows, snow covered the town roofs in pale silence. But inside the hall, people watched Caleb the way townspeople watched storms rolling toward their homes, carefully, nervously, hoping they stayed distant. "Told you she was desperate," someone muttered near the back pews. Eliza heard it. So did Caleb. Neither reacted. That unsettled her more. She married him because every other choice felt worse. After her father's death, men twice her age began offering money to settle old debts through marriage, and Caleb Turner, the quiet widower everyone avoided, became the safest, dangerous option left in town. During the wagon ride to the ranch, Caleb spoke only once. "Blankets are behind the seat if you're cold." Nothing else. No welcome. No questions. Eliza studied him carefully instead. Tall, broad shoulders, gray eyes that never rested anywhere long. He avoided passing near the schoolyard entirely, choosing the longer frozen road around town after children's laughter drifted through the air. That was the first strange thing. The second came when they crossed Miller's Bridge, and an older rancher removed his hat respectfully toward Caleb, but waited until the wagon passed before whispering, "Poor woman." Eliza pretended not to hear it. By nightfall they reached the ranch. The house looked clean from outside, yet the moment Eliza stepped through the doorway, something felt wrong immediately. Not dirty, preserved, like nobody truly lived there anymore. Dust gathered on shelves no one touched. A second teacup still sat inside the kitchen cabinet beside a smaller, cracked mug painted with faded flowers. Curtains remained closed despite daylight disappearing already. Even the clocks had stopped ticking. Caleb carried her bag upstairs silently, stopping only once near the hallway's far end, where a locked white door stood untouched beneath years of dust. His entire body tightened before he looked away again. "That room stays closed," he said flatly. Nothing more. Later that night, Eliza woke after hearing footsteps outside the bedroom. Caleb paced slowly through the hallway for nearly an hour before stopping beside the locked room. Eliza watched the shadow beneath the door without moving. Then came the sound that changed everything. A floorboard creaked near Caleb's bed. Eliza turned slightly and saw him kneeling beside the mattress, holding something tiny in his rough hands beneath the lantern light. His shoulders trembled once before he carefully slid the object back under the bed, like a man hiding part of himself from the world. After he finally left the room again, Eliza waited until the hallway fell silent, then slowly lowered her hand toward the darkness beneath the bed. Eliza's fingers touched leather before she even saw the boots. Tiny, worn at the soles, carefully wrapped inside folded white cloth beneath Caleb Turner's bed, like something sacred instead of forgotten. She froze on the wooden floorboards holding them, while cold lantern light trembled across the room. Child's boots, small enough for a little girl no older than 5. The sight unsettled her harder than anything whispered about Caleb in town, because suddenly the silence inside the ranch house no longer felt frightening. It felt wounded. A floorboard cracked sharply in the hallway outside. Eliza shoved the boots back beneath the bed just as Caleb entered carrying firewood against one shoulder. His eyes moved instantly toward the floor beside the bed before rising toward her face. That tiny movement told Eliza everything. He knew. "Storm's getting worse," Caleb said quietly, though his voice sounded tighter now. Snow hammered the windows harder by evening, trapping both of them inside the ranch house, while wind moaned through the stable boards outside. Caleb remained distant during supper, speaking only when necessary. Yet Eliza began noticing strange details everywhere now that she knew a child once lived here. Faded height marks near the kitchen doorway hidden behind hanging coats. A tiny wooden horse tucked behind dusty books on the shelf. One small spoon polished brighter than the others from years of careful use. The entire house felt frozen around somebody missing. That realization followed Eliza all night. Near midnight, she woke thirsty and walked downstairs quietly toward the kitchen lantern still glowing faintly beside the stove. Voices drifted through the partly open back door. Caleb stood outside beneath the stable awning, speaking softly to Wade Mercer, while snow blew around them. "She found them?" Wade asked carefully. Silence stretched several seconds before Caleb answered. "The cloth was folded wrong." Eliza stopped breathing completely. "Then tell her the truth," Wade muttered. Caleb shook his head once. "People already think enough of me." Wade looked toward the dark house windows uneasily. "That woman married you despite the rumors. Maybe she deserves more than shadows and locked doors." Caleb's expression hardened instantly after that. "I said leave it alone." Wade eventually rode away through the storm, leaving Caleb standing alone beneath the lantern outside. Eliza hurried back upstairs before he returned, but sleep never came afterward because now she understood something important. The townspeople did not fear Caleb because he was cruel. They feared him because grief had hollowed him into someone impossible to reach. The third hook came just before dawn. Eliza woke again after hearing movement beside the bed and kept her eyes closed instinctively. Caleb knelt silently on the floorboards, only inches away, holding the tiny boots beneath lantern light. His rough thumb brushed gently across the cracked leather before his shoulders tightened once, like a man struggling not to break apart. Then, so quietly, Eliza almost thought she imagined it, Caleb whispered into the darkness, "I should have come home sooner, Rosie." Caleb avoided looking at Eliza the next morning, not because he thought she slept through the whispered apology beside the bed, but because deep down, he already knew she had heard it. The silence between them changed after that. Before, the ranch house felt cold. Now it felt haunted by something far sadder than fear. During breakfast, Caleb stood near the stove, drinking black coffee, while snowlight filtered weakly through curtains that had likely remained closed for years. Eliza noticed him glance once toward the hallway's locked white door before immediately looking away again. "Who was Rosie?" she asked quietly. Caleb froze completely. The coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. For one dangerous second, Eliza thought he might leave the room entirely instead of answering. "My daughter," he said finally. 2 words only, but the grief inside them filled the entire kitchen. Caleb disappeared into the barn immediately afterward and stayed there until dark. That was the first hook. The second arrived later that afternoon, when Margaret Doyle visited carrying fresh bread and winter medicine herbs. The older widow stepped into the ranch house slowly, studying the open curtains and warm stove with visible surprise. "House feels different already," she murmured, before lowering her voice toward Eliza. "That man hasn't let sunlight properly inside this place since the child died." Eliza remained silent, waiting. Margaret sighed heavily before continuing. "Rose was 5. Fever took her during the worst winter storm Miller's Crossing ever saw." She paused briefly. "Caleb wasn't home." The sentence landed like a stone. Margaret explained the rest carefully. Caleb had stayed several extra days completing a cattle contract, despite worsening weather, because the ranch desperately needed money after a difficult season. By the time snow finally cleared enough for him to return, Rose had already died in her mother's arms. His wife followed from illness less than a year later. Town stopped blaming the storm eventually, Margaret whispered sadly. Caleb never did. That night, Eliza finally understood why the clocks inside the house no longer worked. Time itself had stopped here years ago. The third hook came after midnight. Eliza woke again after hearing muffled sounds outside near the stable and followed the lantern glow carefully through falling snow. Caleb sat alone inside the barn, beside an empty stall, holding the tiny boots in both hands, while horses shifted quietly around him. Eliza stopped near the doorway unseen. Caleb looked smaller somehow sitting there beneath the lantern light, not frightening at all now, only exhausted from carrying grief too heavy for one man too long. I tried, Rosie, he whispered brokenly towards the boots. God help me. I tried to get home. Eliza's chest tightened painfully, hearing the guilt inside his voice, because suddenly the feared rancher everyone avoided no longer resembled a monster hidden behind silence. He looked like a father who never emotionally survived arriving too late. Then a loose board cracked beneath Eliza's boot. Caleb looked up instantly toward the doorway, eyes sharp with shock and humiliation after realizing someone finally witnessed the grief he spent years hiding from the world. He did not mention the barn incident the next morning, but the silence between him and Eliza changed again after she saw him holding the tiny boots beside the empty stall. Before, his distance felt deliberate. Now it felt defensive, like a man trying to protect the last fragile pieces of himself from being seen too clearly. Eliza understood something important while watching him avoid her eyes during breakfast. Caleb Turner did not fear judgment anymore. He feared attachment. That realization shaped everything she did afterward. Instead of forcing conversations about Rose or the locked nursery, Eliza quietly began changing the ranch house itself. Curtains opened during daylight. Dust-covered blankets disappeared from furniture. Fresh bread replaced untouched canned meals beside the stove. Small things, gentle things. Yet every change unsettled Caleb more than arguments would have, because warmth slowly returned to rooms built around grief, frozen in time. The first hook arrived 3 evenings later, when Wade Mercer stepped inside carrying saddle parts and stopped near the doorway looking genuinely confused. "Place doesn't sound dead anymore," he muttered while hearing soft music from the kitchen humming under Eliza's breath. Caleb stiffened immediately at the word, dead. Eliza noticed the reaction. So did Wade. The second hook came later during supper when Caleb unexpectedly stayed at the table after finishing, instead of escaping outside to the barn. Snowlight reflected softly through the now open curtains, while Eliza repaired one of his torn coat sleeves near the lantern. Neither spoke much, yet the silence no longer felt empty. Then Caleb quietly said something that stopped her hands completely. "You shouldn't get too comfortable here." Eliza looked up slowly. Caleb stared toward the dark window instead of her. "People think grief fades if enough time passes," he continued flatly. "Truth is, you just get better at carrying it quietly." Eliza waited several seconds before answering. "Then why keep carrying it alone?" Caleb's jaw tightened immediately after hearing that. Tiny crack, bigger than before. Because surviving when she didn't already feels wrong enough. The confession settled heavily through the room, because now Eliza finally understood the true prison trapping him inside this house. Caleb believed happiness itself betrayed the child he lost. Later that night, Eliza woke after hearing movement inside the bedroom and saw Caleb standing near the wardrobe, holding the tiny boots again beneath weak lantern light. But something had changed this time. Slowly, carefully, he placed the boots onto the upper shelf inside the wardrobe, instead of hiding them beneath the bed again. Eliza watched silently from beneath the blanket because the gesture felt far larger than moving old leather. For years, Caleb hid his grief where nobody could touch it. Tonight, for the first time, he placed it somewhere visible. The third hook arrived moments later when Caleb turned towards the hallway and accidentally whispered another name into the darkness before realizing Eliza remained awake. Anna, his late wife's name. Caleb froze instantly after saying it aloud, horror crossing his face like he had committed betrayal against both the dead and the living at once. Then, without another word, he walked out of the room and disappeared into the snow-covered barn before Eliza could stop him. The storm trapped them halfway up Black Ridge Pass. One moment Caleb and Eliza were guiding the wagon through falling snow after delivering medicine to a neighboring ranch, and the next, the mountain road disappeared beneath white wind so thick even the horses panicked against their harnesses. "Cabins ahead," Caleb shouted over the storm, while pulling the lead horse toward a narrow tree line, barely visible through the snow. By the time they reached the abandoned supply cabin, both of them were half frozen, and the wagon wheels nearly buried. Caleb secured the horses outside alone, despite the worsening wind, and when he finally stumbled through the cabin door, snow covered his shoulders and beard completely. Eliza rushed forward instinctively to help remove his frozen gloves before stopping herself halfway. Caleb noticed. For one quiet second, neither moved. Then he let her help anyway. That was the first hook. The second arrived hours later after the storm sealed them inside for the night. Firelight flickered softly across the small cabin, while wind screamed against the walls hard enough to shake dust from the ceiling beams. Caleb sat near the lantern repairing broken harness leather, mostly to avoid conversation, but grief lingered too close between them now to keep hiding forever. Finally, Eliza asked the question both carried since winter began. What really happened the night Rose died? Caleb's hand stopped moving instantly. Silence stretched painfully long before he answered. I chose cattle over going home. The confession landed harder than shouting. Slowly, piece by piece, the full truth emerged. Years earlier, Caleb received word Rose's fever worsened while he was finishing a profitable cattle route before winter closed the trails. He could have turned back immediately. Instead, he convinced himself there was still enough time to finish the contract first, because the ranch desperately needed money after several failed seasons. Then the storm arrived early. By the time I reached the house, Caleb's voice broke sharply before he forced it steady again. She was already gone. Firelight flickered across his face, while years of buried guilt finally surfaced openly between them. Anna never blamed me, he whispered bitterly. That almost made it worse. Eliza stared at him quietly because suddenly everything inside the ranch house made sense now. The stopped clocks, the closed curtains, the hidden boots beneath the bed. Caleb did not preserve grief because he loved pain. He preserved it because surviving felt like betrayal. The third hook came near midnight after the storm worsened again outside. Caleb stood near the cabin window staring into darkness when Eliza quietly crossed the room and took his hand for the first time since their marriage. Caleb tensed instantly beneath her fingers. Eliza expected him to pull away. Instead, his shoulders lowered slowly, almost painfully, like a man exhausted from holding himself together too long. You came back every day after she died, didn't you? Eliza asked softly. Caleb nodded once without looking at her. To the barn, he admitted quietly, because hearing the house empty afterward felt worse. Then finally, for the first time in years, Caleb Turner allowed another person to remain beside him while he grieved instead of facing the darkness alone. Spring arrived quietly at the ranch, but Caleb Turner noticed the change everywhere now because for the first time in years, he was actually paying attention to life again. Snow melted from the lower fence lines. Horses crowded the pasture gates before sunrise. The kitchen no longer felt like a room people passed through silently on their way somewhere else. Some mornings Caleb even caught himself returning early, just to hear Eliza humming softly near the stove. Before she realized, he was standing in the doorway, listening. That frightened him more than grief ever had. The first hook came during supper one evening when Wade Mercer laughed at something Eliza said, and Caleb unexpectedly laughed too. The sound lasted barely 2 seconds. Small. Rusted. Yet the entire room fell silent afterward because nobody there had heard Caleb laugh since before Rose died. Caleb noticed the reaction immediately, and his expression tightened at once, almost ashamed of forgetting sadness long enough to sound alive again. Later that night, Eliza woke and discovered the tiny boots missing from the wardrobe shelf entirely. Panic hit her instantly. She searched beneath the bed, inside the wardrobe, even near the locked nursery door before fear settled heavily into her chest. Had Caleb hidden himself inside grief again? The second hook arrived the next morning when Wade found her standing worried near the stable and quietly pointed toward the old oak tree beyond the pasture hill. "He's there," Wade said softly. Eliza followed the path through wet spring grass and stopped completely still after reaching the hilltop. Caleb stood beneath the giant oak, repairing a small wooden swing hanging from one of the branches. The ropes looked old enough to break apart in his hands. Eliza realized immediately whose swing it had been. Caleb noticed her presence, but kept working anyway. "Rose used to make me push her higher than the branch line," he said quietly, without turning around. Anna hated watching it. Eliza stepped closer slowly while wind moved through the tree overhead. "Why now?" she asked softly. Caleb finally looked toward her then, and for the first time she saw real fear instead of grief inside his eyes. "Because I'm starting to remember less." The confession hit harder than anything else he revealed all winter. Caleb lowered his gaze toward the swing afterward. "Some mornings I can't hear her voice clearly anymore," he admitted quietly. "And God help me, forgetting scares me worse than losing her did." Eliza's chest tightened painfully, hearing the guilt still chained around his heart. She reached toward his hand instinctively this time, and Caleb let her hold it without hesitation now. The third hook came later that evening after rain moved across the ranch at sunset. Eliza walked upstairs carrying folded laundry and stopped near the hallway's far end. The locked nursery door stood slightly open for the first time since her arrival. Warm lamplight spilled softly across the floorboards from inside the room Caleb had spent years refusing to enter. Eliza stood outside the nursery door for nearly a full minute before touching it. The room beyond had remained closed so long, the air inside carried the faint stillness of forgotten years. Yet warm lantern light now softened the shadows instead of hiding them. Caleb stood beside the window silently watching spring rain slide down the glass, while dust drifted slowly through pale morning sunlight across the nursery floor. For one painful second, Eliza thought he might change his mind and close the door again. Instead, Caleb stepped aside quietly. "Come in," he said. That simple invitation felt larger than unlocking the room itself, because Caleb Turner had spent years protecting his grief more fiercely than his own life. The first hook came the moment Eliza entered fully and saw Rose's tiny boots resting openly on the nursery shelf beneath the sunlight, instead of hidden beneath a bed or wrapped in cloth. Nearby sat a small cradle covered for years, beneath a white sheet now folded carefully across the rocking chair. Nothing inside the room looked abandoned anymore. It looked paused. Caleb crossed towards the cradle slowly, fingers tightening once against the wood rail before he finally spoke again. "I used to sit outside this room at night after everyone slept," he admitted quietly. "Could never make myself walk inside." Eliza listened silently while rain tapped softly against the windows around them. "Every time I heard laughter somewhere in town," Caleb continued, voice rougher now, "I kept thinking Rose should have lived long enough to sound like that too." The second hook arrived, when Caleb suddenly stopped speaking and stared toward the tiny boots beneath the sunlight. "You know the worst part?" he whispered. "I almost hated happy people after she died." Shame crossed his face immediately afterward, like admitting the thought aloud betrayed the man he wanted to be. Eliza moved beside him slowly then. "That wasn't hatred," she answered softly. "That was pain with nowhere left to go." Caleb looked toward her quietly after hearing that, and for the first time all winter he did not seem frightened by being understood anymore. Together they pulled open the nursery curtains wider, allowing full spring sunlight to flood the room, while dust moved golden through the air across the cradle and shelf. The house no longer felt frozen around loss. It finally felt connected to life again. The third hook came just before sunset. Eliza returned upstairs after supper carrying folded blankets and stopped in the hallway. A second rocking chair now sat beside the nursery window, facing the cradle instead of away from it. Caleb stood nearby, adjusting the chair awkwardly, like a man uncertain whether he deserved peace yet. When he noticed Eliza watching, he lowered his eyes briefly before speaking. "Loving you started feeling dangerous," he admitted quietly. "Then one morning I realized something worse." Eliza stepped closer. Caleb looked toward the nursery shelf where Rose's tiny boots rested openly beneath the fading evening light. "Grief buried enough of this house already," he whispered. "I don't want it burying the living too." And in that moment, Eliza finally understood the real healing inside the ranch had never been about forgetting the child Caleb lost. It was about teaching a broken man that loving someone again did not betray the dead. It honored the part of his heart that survived them. What moment broke your heart the most in Caleb's story? If you enjoy emotional frontier dramas filled with quiet healing, hidden grief, and unforgettable ranch stories, subscribe to Echoes of a Rancher for more cinematic Western storytelling.